Welcome to the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System Test Center, a division of Barnstable County's Department of Health and Environment. MassTC is the nation's premier third-party testing and research facility for innovative alternative on-site septic treatment technologies. One of the most important ways that any septic system regulation can protect the public health is through the use of setbacks. Setback distances are designed to keep people and water resources a safe distance from potentially harmful wastewater. This training will focus on 5 setback categories: property lines, building foundations, wetland resources, water supply wells, and groundwater. Our staff sat down with 3 practicing health agents to ask them about some of the details of setbacks in Massachusetts Title V and how they and their boards of health have handled certain situations.
My name's Bob Canning. I work for the town of Orleans, and I've been there for 37 years as its health agent.
My name is Jane Crowley. I work for the town of Eastham. I'm the health agent, director of health and the environment.
My name's Glenn Harrington. I've been the health agent at Mashpee 20 years, and I was an inspector 4 years before that in the town of Barnstable.
We've got 5 Title V setbacks we're going to talk about today. We've got property lines, foundations, wells, groundwater, and wetland resources. Of the 5 setbacks, which one do you consider to be the most important, and what do you consider to be the least important? How would you rank them?
Okay, if I was ranking them, if we understand that wells are potable water wells, I would say that is the most important. Okay, if it is not potable, if it's non-potable, I would probably go with the groundwater separation. The least important, I would say, would be property line setbacks. I think that is the furthest from being an environmental setback compared to the others.
Why did you pick wells and groundwater as the most important?
Well, we look at sewage primarily as pathogenic, and if we are going to have someone have their drinking water source, and we're going to grant variances to allow sewage to encroach on that well, it can run into issues with both nutrients and bacteria that can adversely affect the recipient of the water. So I think of prime importance is to make sure that we protect the drinking water sources.
Well, first I would rank wells as first for potential exposure for human and for the occupants, and then I would look at groundwater separation next for protection of the environment, and then wetland resources, and then foundations, and then property lines last.
I guess I'd start with the most important setback being the well setback. Working in a community that only recently developed a municipal water system, all of our properties up until this point in time have been served by wells. So drinking water is critically important to public health, and that would be definitely ranked as the number 1 setback requirement in terms of providing that public health and environmental protection.
Great. And then, so wells are first. What's the order after wells?
I would say wetlands. Obviously, we have many sensitive receptors, and wastewater, even a small amount of nutrient loading, has a significant impact. So that is a critical concern in our community. We have many freshwater ponds, we have estuaries on either side. We're surrounded by water. So that is always a very important criteria that we are looking for.
Would it be accurate to say that property lines and foundations are the least important?
Yes, I would say so. Clearly, we require, upon installation, a certified as-built with a land surveyor stamp. So the components are identified specifically on the lots. But I would say that of all the setback requirements, foundation setbacks and the property line setbacks are clearly on the lower end of the spectrum.
Because they don't affect public health as much?
Yes, I mean, we can waterproof a foundation so that there is not horizontal transmission from the effluent. Property lines, we want to make sure that the effluent is discharged on site. And Also, you have to be considerate of the abutters. I think engineers do that as a matter of fact in their planning process. We don't want to negatively affect other people's site constraints. And by going directly up against the property line, you could create a more of a hardship, I would say, on abutters. So engineers do a very good job of trying to stick with the 10 feet and, if necessary, going up to the 5 feet and getting the variance.
So let's start with the easy ones and maybe figure out why they're in the code. Why would you think like setbacks from property lines or foundations would be in the code? What's the main driving force there?
I think that they have to be considered for various reasons. I'll give an example for property lines, and we have it coming up at a meeting later this month where someone is constructing the septic system and they will be 3 feet away from the property line with their primary and on the property line with their reserve. If that were just allowed, the concerns of excavation onto a property that's not owned by the owner will come into question. So I don't think that you can put a septic system where you want to put it unless you take into consideration, do I have permission to disturb the property of my neighbor, whether that be the owner of the street or the owner of the abutting property. The second would be setback from septic system to septic system. If they're encroaching on the property line and you encroach on the property line, that would be potential conflict. So I think Title V says you have to maintain 10 feet. So again, consideration would have to be as to what is on the neighbor's side of the property line.
Clearly, the effluent discharge needs to be on site. And so it's really important that you establish that boundary. In terms of the foundation, you do see horizontal migration. So we do not want effluent discharged into livable space. So the septic tank needs to have a specific setback, and if it is required that there's a variance, then that can be considered.
Well, my understanding for the foundations is that the location of the soil absorption system, if it's too close to the crawl space or cellar wall, then you have the potential for impact to odors and effluent. And so that's for protection of the occupants.
What criteria does your Board of Health use when determining how or if these setbacks should be varied?
So they are the least environmental variance that we have. It does not affect the environment as you would if you're encroaching on a resource. So the board's going to take into consideration, is it going to damage, let's say, the structural stability of the existing house, the existing swimming pool? Can the installation go in without damaging the components themselves, because it's going to be difficult to get a machine that close to a house? With a septic tank, although we like to believe they're watertight, they're not. You can, in certain situations, have migration towards a foundation if that tank leaks. And certainly foundations aren't watertight. So you can actually have the sewage create a damp basement if it gets into a crack in the foundation. So you want to be aware of that. If the board was concerned about that, they would probably require a poly barrier between the tank and the foundation to make sure that the effluent doesn't get there. Okay, for property lines, we discussed that. You have to be concerned as to, can you construct the system without damaging the neighbor's property? Are you encroaching on a resource on their property or encroaching on their septic system? So the board would take that into consideration and weigh it against the other variances that would be required if they don't grant that variance.
In terms of looking at each site specifically, I think each lot brings with it its own constraints. So as mentioned, we consider the well variance to be the most significant, and we just try to work within the boundary. What's the best and maximum feasible compliance we can achieve given this particular situation, and perhaps the abutting properties as well. They bring constraints to the property in question in many cases.
We use the same standard of uh, variance review for Title V, both equal environmental protection and manifest injustice if there is a hardship. I think you have to look at any of the hardships, and also for the homeowner a financial hardship as well.
So when your board looks at these and when you review a plan, is there any substantial difference between the review that goes on if this is new construction and somebody's going to build a house too close to a line and have to put his system close to a property line, or a repair? Is there any difference in the review at all?
Yes, I think there should be. In a repair, you are not dealing with a fresh lot, you're dealing with something that's in existence, something of value that's in existence, certainly to the property owner. And you should have some type of consideration when you're granting a variance. So you should have some discretion on granting variances on a repair. Per Title V and the standard of review, you have far less discretion on new construction, and I think that's fine. They're starting a new project, and they would be creating the variance with their project. So I do think that two separate standards of review are a good idea.
I mean, I think new construction, your goal is full compliance, whereas when you have something pre-existing, you have to work within what constraints you're given. So I think there is a different approach that we take.
Whereas for repairs, he'll be maybe more lenient on those setbacks.
Yes, and I think you just have to work to maximize the compliance that you achieve.
I don't think there's any difference in the review, but there's definitely difference in the mitigation.
Okay.
And so I think that's the difference, is that the standard of review is the same, but the mitigation can definitely be different. Within Title V, there is actually a priority under maximum feasible compliance that the property line setback actually be requested first. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time because the engineers and the homeowners are looking to get the septic system approved and installed, because that variance requires, in most towns, a board meeting so that the abutter notification can occur and the abutter has the chance to be heard at a public meeting. So I think that that's the proper way to do it. The only thing you have to do is check to make sure there isn't a septic system within 10 feet on the other side of the property line.
Nearly every town on Cape Cod has increased setbacks when it comes to wetlands. Can you tell us what your town's is and what was the reasoning behind why they chose that?
Sure. So in Orleans, from a soil absorption system, we're 100 feet to the edge of the wetlands. Title V is 50 feet. They made this change years ago in the 80s, and is the board being conservative to make sure that the resources are being protected, to make sure that you're maximizing the distance, for viral and bacterial travel, trying to make sure that the water resource doesn't get contaminated with any pathogens from the wastewater system. Also, as time's gone on with things such as phosphorus, there is some benefit to a greater distance, although how great that distance has to be is up for debate. But certainly the further away you are, the longer you're delaying the impact from phosphorus.
For the wetlands, specifically for border vegetated wetland, we actually just recently changed our regulation, mainly because in the original regulation that I think that was back under the 78 code was the water course, and water course goes by the actual edge of the water body, and the border vegetated wetland is obviously the edge of a vegetated wetland that is defined by Wetland Protection Act. So what we did was we had another regulation for if you were less than 75 feet to the border vegetated wetland, the board or the regulation required ultraviolet disinfection. So because of the difference in the definition, a UV light and disinfection could actually be installed without a D-night. and the F1 quality without the D-night makes the UV very ineffective. So we went consistent with 75 feet to the border vegetated wetland for both the D-night and UV disinfection.
Okay, so that's anything closer than 75
The soil
feet.
absorption system closer than 75 feet.
And your setback is 100 feet?
Nope, the setback for 100, we don't use the 100, we use the 75 feet for
Okay.
both.
75 feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we have different setbacks that are more conservative. We have a 100-foot setback for the leaching area, the soil absorption area, and we have a 50-foot setback for the tank. We have impaired estuaries. We have such valuable resources that we're just trying to do the best we can and think it's in the best interest of the community to have that additional protection.
With wetland setbacks, is there a difference between repairs and new constructions when it comes to review?
Yes, and for the same reason. Again, you have a existing situation, and in many cases, houses were built on a very delicate piece of property. Long before there were regulations, normally we come across these, they still have cesspools. And they have to repair their septic system, or they could lose the use of their house. If they had to prove that they lose all beneficial use of their dwelling if they don't get the variance, and nothing short of that, that would be pretty difficult. There's financial considerations, etc. So the Board of Health works to assist people in coming into the greatest compliance that they can, minimizing the impacts on resources. New construction, it's different. You're starting out with a fresh lot and you're creating the situation. There may be some cases where they can meet the standard review for the variances. There may be some situations where variances are absolutely warranted, but I think they have to be looked at with a little more, more of a critical eye than you would on a repair.
Again, we have all of our lots in the town of Eastham are deemed nitrogen sensitive because of the well situation. Not all people are going to connect to municipal water, and we thought it was very important to hold the line and require everyone to be classified as nitrogen sensitive. We also have an overlying determination that is called environmentally sensitive. So in environmentally sensitive lots, one being adjacent to a wetland, Board of Health can actually impose a higher level of compliance, meaning if there's a request for a reduction, they can consider the need for innovative alternative septic systems to reduce the nutrient load to the environment.
What compensating mechanisms does your board use when it comes to granting these setback variances?
So depending on what the setback variance is, the board would consider requiring IA technology, maybe a impervious barrier between a resource and a soil absorption system. May require greater distance to depth of groundwater, depending on what the variance is, trying to capture all the viruses that you can, in the unsaturated area underneath your septic system. So they've done that. They have, in granting variances, in many cases have a deed restriction limiting the number of bedrooms. In some cases, they limit the size of the dwelling, that the dwelling cannot be increased for more living space, which could be more people habitating the property.
And what would more people habitating the property mean?
That means more flushing at the toilet. So, your wastewater is determined not really by number of bathrooms or anything else. It's the number of people that are inside the dwelling unit, and how they're using the water water inside the house, whether it be showering, toilet facilities, dishes, etc. So that goes up with every person you have, and it's creating more nutrients. It's creating more sewage. Bigger issue that you have to handle with the septic system.
Sure. We use, obviously, when you're first looking at a property, distance is key. So as far away as one can locate the septic system, that's what we want to work with in the first level. Second level is innovative alternative septic treatment, part of the answer or solution to the problem, and finally a deed restriction, which would then limit future development. And we always include in our conditions of approval that these projects are abutter notified, so that if anyone requests a change in the footprint of the structure, it needs to come back to the Board of Health for review and evaluation, and that the abutters are notified of that request coming before the board.
Can you think of any one particular case that was contentious or difficult to resolve, specifically about a wetland setback?
I think that Eastham has an estuary, Nauset Harbor estuarian system that is subject to a total maximum daily loaded limit. It is an impaired estuary, and so I would say that we have many properties that we have to evaluate pretty stringently. We know that we need to improve the water quality in that estuary, so it's not one per se, it's really an entire shoreline that we're trying to protect. And we are looking at wastewater management strategies, and this type of an approach, one lot at a time, is also the way we're going. So it's not one, I think it's many.
Well, for wetland setbacks, the one wetland setback, the one that I remember actually wasn't me as a health agent, was actually one in my private sector work. Was I had a septic plan that was prepared by another engineering firm, and I was hired to actually represent the plan to the Board of Health. And in that case, the proposed septic system and dwelling, this was new construction, so it was a new house and new septic system, and the proposed septic and dwelling were on the elevated portion of the lot, and the lower part of the lot was a portion of a wetland that was in behind a coastal dune area and a coastal river. And there was an issue with the benchmark that was brought up. The benchmark got resolved, and once that got resolved, it showed that the elevated area was actually a coastal bank, because the floodplain and the flood zones came right up against the elevated area. And in that case, the Board of Health decided to deny the project based upon a submittal protocol where the owners of the engineering firm that I was representing at the time, they went right to the Board of Health and not to the Conservation Commission, and sent them back to the Conservation Commission. And I found that odd, because the Board of Health has a regulation that said that you can't build in the coastal bank. And I think that their legal position would have been much stronger if they had denied it based upon their own regulation rather than a submittal.
And in the office, we were just talking about this, in fact.
Okay.
And we had a repair to a septic system. It had extreme high water. It was surrounded on 3 sides by wetlands. And it was really just a little peninsula of land that the house was on, and the existing septic system was there. Existing septic system, I think, were cesspools. Clearly they were in groundwater, and they were 7 feet away from the wetlands. So a lot of variances were needed, setback variances, etc. The Board of Health worked with the engineer. They ended up granting the variances, but they had to put in a mounted system to increase the separation between the bottom of the system and groundwater. They required pressure dosing to make sure that the effluent was spread out, so that again would create a aerobic condition underneath the system, and also help the system to last longer. Restrictions, in that case, no more bedrooms, so they capped the bedrooms as to what it was. But it was a real tough one, and several meetings were needed and several different plans that they came up with. They also put in an IA technology to reduce nutrients and hopefully reduce the bacteria as well.
In your experience, do you get many requests for variances from well or groundwater setbacks?
We do get some to groundwater, very few to wells. And groundwater separations quite often, so Title V is going to call perched water groundwater. A section of town, a large section of town, has a lot of perched water. And the board has to view that as to whether or not they're going to require a mounded system in all these cases on small lots that would really cover up the front windows of the house. I mean, some of them are extreme. And, so the board has granted some variances to perched water. That will require a poly barrier between the 5-foot excavation. They actually have asked for an extra foot of excavation as a precaution. So they've asked for a poly barrier to be put in between the excavation and the edge of the soil absorption system that would prevent the perched water from flowing towards the septic system. So it's going to maintain that water, in this case 6 feet away, until it gets down below 5 feet below the bottom of the leaching area. So it's making a situation that would be very difficult for the homeowner in terms of aesthetics, and it's something that can be controlled with the polyvinyl barrier. So it works out well.
Yes, I would say more well setbacks because of our entire community. 6,000 parcels, originally all served by on-site private wells, and our municipal water system is not available to all of those properties at this time. So there are many requests that come from pre-existing non-conforming structures, meaning those structures were built long ago, small cottages perhaps on teeny tiny lots, less than 10,000 square feet. So clearly it's very difficult to locate a well 100 feet away from the leach area, from the coastal bank or whatever. So it's really all of those, that previous non-zoning that has resulted in this situation that we have so many wells that are in very close proximity, in some cases, to the leaching facilities.
The Mashpee is about 90% town water, so we don't get too many requests. There are the odd variance requests for existing systems, and most of the existing properties that were approved back under the 100-foot state setback for the leaching facility. So in those cases, though, the board will grant the 150-foot variance to allow them to be more than the 100. If it's an existing condition, the board will require a D-night if it's less than 100 feet, and if it's new construction, there will be a D-night if it's less than 150.
When it comes to wells and groundwater, does your board consider different standards when it comes to repairs and new construction?
Again, yes. And in fact, the questions before were, do I feel that there should be a difference in the standard of review? This time you were asking, does the board have a different view? And standard of review itself is different. They have to prove that they would lose all reasonable use of their property. A pretty hefty standard for an applicant to use. So if it's let's say depth to groundwater, they would probably be more than willing to put in a mounded system to get that 5-foot zone between the bottom of the system and the groundwater. So it kind of takes care of itself because they're creating the issue by developing a lot that otherwise wouldn't meet the code. So that this Title V standard of review really forces the hand on that one.
I think we can definitely, go right back to the comments that I made about the pre-existing non-conforming. It's an allowed use. So it's not that we can take this land use away. So we have to deal with the constraints that exist and do the best job we can to maximize the compliance. Whereas new construction, we have the option of looking at this through a fresh lens. Does the property comply? And it's just a completely different situation. In our town, just like most towns on Cape Cod, I think at this point, there are very few vacant lots left. So we're looking at reconstruction. People are trying to maximize the use of the dwelling, perhaps increase the size by double, increase the use of the home over a longer period of the year. So it's the remodeling and the renovation that really is driving a lot of the variance requests that we see.
Well, what I can say is that as far as the difference in review for new construction or repairs, I think the standard of review is the same, but the mitigations are different. For the wells, 150 feet is our requirement, and if you're less than that with new construction, the board does look for additional treatment. And for existing, if the house or the subdivision was developed under the state 100-foot limit, then the board will grant the 150-foot variance as long as the leaching is more than 100 feet. If the leaching is less than 100 feet, then the D-night would be required per our board.
So would that be for new construction too, that less than 100 feet? Would that be a state variance that would have to go up to the state?
The state doesn't review the Title V variances anymore. In this case, the board, we did have one situation where there were two abutters that put wells right on the property lines and basically tried to make the vacant property in between unbuildable. And all that did was create a hardship for the owner of the vacant parcel. And so the board did grant, they were less than 100 feet. I think they were more in the terms of 90 feet. And the board did allow the new construction to occur, but the owner of the vacant parcel ended up putting in a Bousse system to the tune of about $30,000, but which provides excellent treatment and effluent.
You mentioned that IA systems are often used for wetland setbacks. Can you name some of the common mechanisms that your board usually sees or recommends when it comes specifically to well and groundwater setbacks?
Well, as we discussed, groundwater direction is a big issue. The depth to groundwater is a big issue. Okay, we can't change the groundwater direction, we can change the depth to groundwater. So the board may ask for them to raise the system to be, if it's sandy soil, 5 feet above groundwater. As for the groundwater direction, is there a way that they can move the septic system, a satisfactory way they can move the system to be sure that it is not upstream from the well, either their well or the abutter's well? If they own the well, they can relocate the well and have that be upstream of the septic system, which may be a good measure for them to use.
I really think it's all the same approach. I don't think it differs much. In one case, you're looking at the environmental impact of the effluent, and in the other case, you're looking at the public health impact from the drinking water on that lot. So it's usually some of both, if you will, in these small lots that have close proximity to our resources. Again, I think Eastham and the Outer Cape is so dynamic. We see such significant coastal erosion, and we are surrounded on both sides by Cape Cod Bay on one side, the Atlantic Ocean on the other. So it's really hard to isolate one particular situation. I think so many of these lots come before the board because of their individual site constraints, and it's very hard to isolate one from another, but I think we are being stressed in terms of redevelopment, and that is a really important factor that the board has to take strides to deal with. The needs and desires of the homeowner contrasted to the environmental and public health protection, not only of that particular lot, but of the abutting lots and properties.
When you say that your board feels the stress of redevelopment, that ties into what you said before, as far as the vacant lots are gone, and so people are trying to reuse the property that they have.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think we're seeing that everywhere on Cape Cod, that the small cottages pretty much are a thing of the past, and those are being replaced by very expensive, larger homes that are used on a year-round basis. So the existing septic system that served the cottage that was built in the 50s just is not adequate for the tear down and reconstruction of a much larger home that's used much more time of the year.
Let's say you have a situation where you may have a particularly emotional homeowner or even engineer, and let's say that you, as the health agent, see that your board may be starting to get swayed by these high emotions or contentions. As a health agent, how would you try and maybe help walk your board back into saying, no, the homeowner's being unreasonable, maybe they're emotional, but what would you do in that situation to kind of help guide your board?
I try to stick with the law and regulations. I try not to get into the emotion of it, and our decisions and where we lead the board is factually based. So I've been very privileged in my 20 years of working in Eastham of having a very understanding, compassionate board that is open-minded and listens to what the applicant is saying. And I think people want to be heard and want to at least have a chance of explaining what they want and how they want to do it. And at the end of that, I think a board needs to deliberate based on the law and regulations, and of course, understanding any particular hardship. But you try to separate yourself from the emotion of the situation and just professionally explain your rationale and hope that they understand. And I would say most of the time they do. We walk away with a good outcome.
So I'm guessing that a lot of your advice to your own board is know their own regulation and base all their findings and their sort of direction based on the regulation and not on perhaps some inappropriate protocol that was conducted.
Right, they have to be careful not to deny things based upon a policy or a submittal protocol. The regulation really has the teeth of the law behind it. We're a science-based operation, so we need to be based on science. So I would have to advise any board to work on the science and to base their decisions on some study that was done that is considered an industry standard, and not go too far awry from that, because the regulation would be considered arbitrary if it was gone beyond some industry standard.
What about those situations where you have a homeowner who's next door just doesn't want to see the property go in or doesn't want to see his neighbor enlarge the house? Do you come up with those situations where I don't want him that close to my property line, why should I let this happen, kind of thing?
We have had that situation where, and many times there's ulterior motives that go along with that, where on the Cape where we have visibility issues where one house is blocking another, and so that's probably more where we come in. And they use us as a tool really to try to prohibit someone from doing that, but people have the right to use their own properties. Granted, they can't force drainage onto another property, so you have to make sure that the engineering and the septic design is sound where you're not impacting the other property. But if it's a situation that's existing, the septic system comes first. You have to have a septic system for a property, and then if you're going to deny them that, you're looking at manifest injustice, and you're probably going to be forced on granting some variance anyways. But for new construction and keeping the abutters happy, again, it's not all about keeping the abutters happy. It's about allowing people the use of their property and maintaining the septic system to make sure that it does provide environmental protection without causing people some undue hardship.
I always remind the board, in fact, almost always in our introduction, I review the standard of review with the board. So I would go back to that if I see that the board is, teetering on making a decision that they seem very uncomfortable with. Standard of review is what the boards of health should fall back on. They should make findings, they should follow the standard of review and make their determination. So if they were thinking that we're going to grant someone an extra bedroom on their property and have the septic system encroach on something, and they don't like it, but the property owner is there, very emotional, teary, and we need this room and all that, the board's obligation is to that standard of review. It really is. They can be subjective in their own way to evaluate the situation, but still it has to fall under that standard of review. So that is what I would do if the property owner is the one that's emotional in front of the board. Board hopefully will hear that and give them the clarity of really this is how we should make the decision. I got a great board. I've been blessed there with a great board ever since I got there, and always seem to come around to great decisions. The other, if it's a neighbor, and we have quite often, I gave the example of the setbacks to the property lines. We have neighbors that come in and they're upset that their property is going to be damaged. I don't think the Board of Health can give property owner A, who's repairing their system, permission to damage property owner B's. So I would say to the board, we would have to have something. If this person is concerned that their property is going to be damaged, they should evaluate this, and the engineer should report to us what measures will be taken to assure it will not happen. If not, move it 5 feet away from the property line, or five more feet away from the property line. The other thing that happens is that property owners, like their shade trees or their vegetation that is between the lots, and we get quite often that a neighbor is very upset that the property owner who's repairing their system is taking down their own vegetation on their property to site the leaching area. So the neighbor wants that privacy, wants that vegetation to be there. The property owner just wants to repair their system and not have to pump it to the other side of the house, or for whatever reason this is a chosen spot. I would remind the board that really under the standard of review, we're not to take into consideration trees and vegetation. We all want to save trees, don't get me wrong. I'm not harsh in saying level the land, but that's not part of what we're reviewing. The protection to the groundwater is what we're reviewing. And if that means that vegetation has to be taken down to accommodate that, so be it. Okay, can always replant, or the neighbor who's upset, can put in their vegetation, on their sideline, or the two can come to some type of an agreement, which is usually what happens. People are nice, and property owner A is going to say to property owner B, okay, we'll put something back, or let's work together on getting something. So it does get resolved.
Our staff also spoke with an agent of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection to gain some insight from the state level.
My name is Brian Dudley. I work for Mass DEP. I have been with the department for 32 years.
So Brian, while we've got you here, we'd like to talk a little bit about setbacks and the regulations, and they go anywhere from very highly critical ones to ones that don't appear to be as critical. So we're talking about setbacks like from foundations or property lines. Can you give us a little indication of how you think that's in the code and how they fit in and how relatively important they are?
I think when we look at the application of setbacks in Title V, we have to look at the situation in which they're being applied, and if any sort of reductions in setbacks are warranted. So in the instance, say, of new construction, generally what we're looking for is full compliance with the code. And if somebody wants to deviate from full compliance, then they have the variance process to do that. However, in order to get a variance, an applicant has to demonstrate that the design with the variance will provide the same degree of environmental protection as without the variance, and also that denial of the variance would constitute manifest injustice. Equal degree of environmental protection is difficult, but not necessarily insurmountable, particularly if you're looking at some sort of enhanced treatment system. However, manifest injustice is, I think, a much higher hurdle, because there is case law that has basically interpreted manifest injustice as depriving an applicant of all beneficial use of the property. And all beneficial use of the property is very broadly defined, such that if you can derive any use out of the property, even if it's, for example, establishing a birding stand, then you have beneficial use. And denial of a variance does not deprive you of that kind of beneficial use. So standards for deviating from setbacks, regardless of what they are, for new construction, within a strict reading of Title V is very, very difficult. Now, with respect to the philosophy behind some of those setbacks and the reasons why they're in Title V, property line setbacks generally are 10 for a component to be 10 feet off property line. And basically that is to ensure that there's no accidental encroachment of a system component on somebody's property line, and then also to ensure that there is always going to be adequate separation between critical components, so that if, for example, your soil absorption system is 10 feet off the property line and your neighbor's soil absorption system is 10 feet off the property line, that's a 20-foot separation. That is pretty much guaranteed as reasonable assurance that there's not going to be any sort of interaction between the two, that there won't be any sort of adverse impact because of proximity. That's a reasonable separation. Foundation setbacks are in place for a couple reasons. One, that you want to make sure that components are far enough away from a foundation so that if you ever have to go in, say, and replace a septic tank, that you're not so close to a foundation that that kind of excavation would in any way threaten the structural integrity of a building. Another reason is, and this would be more applicable to soil absorption systems, is that you want to prevent any sort of horizontal migration of effluent that may get into a basement or any sort of living space. And in the Cape with sandy soils, that's probably not as much of a concern, because the vertical component of infiltration is much more dominant than the horizontal component of any sort of effluent flow. However, if you get into other soils, in other parts of the state, say that may be more platy, then that horizontal constituent of infiltration may be more dominant than the vertical, and therefore you want to ensure that there is adequate separation so that you don't have any sort of infiltration into any sort of living space or basement. And, you know, through the years, the existing 20-foot separation, say from an SAS to a foundation, is considered adequate for that purpose. And the 10-foot separation, say from a septic tank or any other chamber type component, is sufficient for you know, protecting the structural integrity, as we had mentioned, you know, at the beginning. So, so that addresses property lines, and it addresses foundations. I think another one that you were looking for was wetlands.
Yeah, wetlands and wells. But before we leave that, I've heard you refer to the other two as more administrative ones, that in repair situations are ones that are sort of less critical. Could you speak a little to that, whether these are what you meant by administrative or ones that are sort of less important?
Well, I think, you know, I think the property line setback, as we said, to ensure that there is, you know, sufficient separation between components of systems. Yeah, that is what you could loosely define as, you know, if you had to categorize it as an administrative thing. It's not necessarily a critical environmental component, although I don't want to minimize the importance of having adequate separation, you know, between components. But, you know, that's a way of ensuring it without having to go in and, you know, check, you know, every neighboring lot when you do a plan review. You know, if you're meeting that separation, then you should be okay. The foundation setback, you know, you're starting to get into a little bit of both, because you know, structural integrity of a building is not an environmental concern, but certainly you don't want something tumbling down, you know, as a result of putting in a system. The concern about, you know, horizontal migration, that is, you know, that does get in, you know, start to get into, you know, public health, certainly, concerns, if not environmental concerns specifically. But Title V is looking at both, you know, protection of public health and the environment. So it, you know, that concern certainly is within the purview of and the intent of the regulations.
Yeah, I see. But in a repair situation, they usually put up a barrier, impervious barrier, whereas in new construction, they could still put up a barrier, but they'd have that other hurdle to go over, which would be the manifest injustice piece.
Right, and you know, with the revisions of Title V back in '95, you know, we were looking to streamline how variances were reviewed and approved, because, you know, under the '78 code, we approved all variances, and everything that deviated from the code was a variance. So anything that the Board of Health, you know, reviewed and approved as a variance came to us for our secondary review and approval. So in order to streamline things and keep it more within, you know, the local approving authority's realm of responsibility, we came up with the concept of local upgrade approval. And local upgrade approvals, or those things for repairs that are able to be administered under local upgrade approval, are listed in Title V. And essentially, they are listed in the order, you know, in a hierarchical order. Those that are less critical are right at the beginning, like property line setbacks, like foundation setbacks. Those that become of greater concern with respect to public health and environmental protection, are listed at the bottom. So basically you're going through this, and then if you can't accommodate a fully compliant or a system as compliant as possible with some of, and I use the term less critical very loosely, but some of the less critical deviations from the code, then and only then do you start looking at things like separation, reduced separations to wetlands, or reduced separations to wells, or reduced distance between the bottom of the SAS and groundwater, or any reductions to naturally occurring pervious material.
So as we move off of those that are sort of less critical, we get into the particularly wells and wetlands. Can you speak a little bit to why you believe those are in the code? What are the critical things that a Board of Health should look at when they're even thinking of varying those, or when they're reviewing plans and things like that?
Well, there are a couple schools of thought with respect to wetlands as to why those variances are there. One school of thought suggests that you're protecting the wetlands from the system. There's another school of thought that says you're actually protecting the system from the wetlands. And for that second school of thought, thing is that wetlands exist in hydric soils, and sometimes the boundary of those hydric soils will extend beyond what is traditionally considered the wetland boundary, based on what kind of the vegetative boundary. So what kind of plants you have that are wetlands plants and that delineate that particular boundary. And the thing about hydric soils is that they're not as amenable to a Title V system, because they're hydric, they're not unsaturated, they tend to be comprised of much more organic, loamy, silty material than what you would see in more, say, traditional soil horizons. So, and so there may be an element, from both sides in terms of why you have that. You don't want to have a lot of construction and excavation too close to a wetland, where you may be impacting it, and so that's sort of a protective element. So depending upon site conditions, you also don't want it so close that you might risk effluent breakout within a wetland. So, in that sense, you're protecting the wetland from the system.
Right.
In the other sense, in terms of appropriately siting soil absorption system, you're protecting the system from the wetlands.
So stop, we're both right.
Yeah.
You're both right. It's protecting one from the other and the other from one.
Yeah.
So what about the well setbacks, which are set at 100 feet from in Title V, but many towns have sort of gone further than that. Could you speak a little bit to why the well setback, and if maybe even some sandy soils, it might be appropriate to increase that setback?
Well, the well setback basically is a public health consideration. I think protection from primarily from pathogens. Whether or not certain conservative constituents in effluent are diluted to any appreciable degree. If a well is immediately down gradient of a plume, that's debatable. But the 100-foot setback from a well is primarily for pathogens, and that's been borne out you know, I think, I don't know if this is an apocryphal story or not, but when I had first started with the department, you know, the story went that under previous codes, even before the 78 code, the well setback had been 50 feet. And there was a Cape Town, relatively, you know, in an area that was relatively densely populated, that adhered to that 50-foot setback, and these wells were just popping up with bacterial contamination. And that was tied to, you know, septic effluent. Now, there could have been a, you know, could have been that there were a lot of cesspools, you know, so that these were overloaded, you know, you weren't getting, you know, adequate treatment, you may not have been getting adequate separation, you know, there could have been a whole host of things. But the thing is that did not seem to be an adequately protective separation. So it was increased to 100. And over the years, that does seem to have held up, you know, as, you know, as adequately protective for, you know, the typical constituents that you would look at, like, you know, coliform or, you know, in typical bacterial tests. I know that there is, you know, potentially some concern about viral transport because they may be able to last longer. But that's not something that is, you know, that's typically tested for. But by and large, you know, the 100-foot seems to be appropriate and adequate.
So when we're talking about the setbacks, those are probably the more important ones, the ones directly that affect the public health, viral transport to the well, or surface breakout that might contain viruses that are, of course, then could be exposed to anybody walking through the wetland or pets that go there and then come back into the home. So how would you advise a Board of Health to sort of act on those particular variances? And I mean, I'm a Board of Health member, so I understand there's a lot of times when people come in with all the hardship stories and everything, and I'm sure you've heard them because those variances that get approved at the local level come up to DEP, particularly for that particular variance. So how would you advise boards of health to sort of view those type of variances?
Well, again, you know, we have to make a distinction between a variance, which is primarily for new construction, versus local upgrade approval, which technically is not a variance. It's an approval that allows for reductions and deviations from full compliance with the code. But that being said, and as is stated in Title V, the goal always is maximum feasible compliance. So wherever you can get full compliance, that is what you want. Now, with local upgrade approval, you know, the reason why we've codified the kinds of reductions that are allowed is because you know, we recognize that you may not always be able to meet the same setbacks on an existing property, you know, particularly one that may have been, you know, built before the 95 code, because you know, the 95 code, you know, just the reality of it is it requires bigger systems than, you know, just dropping a leaching pit in, you know, as was allowed under, you know, the 78 code, and was probably the most common, at least here, was the most common, you know, form of soil absorption system. So, you know, there has to be a recognition that not everybody is going to be able to meet full compliance, and what are the reasonable reductions that you can allow, again, following that hierarchy. You know, so if somebody comes in and says, you know, I want 75 feet to the well, but they're putting their soil absorption system, say, 35 feet from their property line. Well, why can't you move that over 25 feet, get the 100 foot from the well, and get your 10 foot from the property line? Or if it's even tighter than that, why can't you move it, say, within 5 feet of the property line and get 100 feet to the well? So, that's the kind of thought process that you would want to look at. What are the ones that are critical to environmental protection, critical to public health protection, and either, if you can't get full compliance with everything, then those are the ones that you want to strive to get at. And even after everything else is considered, you still can't get full compliance with that, then maximize those separations as best you can.
Well, it's been a good review for Board of Health. Think about those local upgrade approvals and how they are in the code sort of scaled appropriately, that you just go down the list with give up the property line before you give up a well or wetlands reduction, give up a foundation before you would give up those. And it's a good way to look at it, and you'd advise the Board of Health to sort of use that as a guideline or template as far as their hierarchy in granting variances to that.
I would, just with this one caveat, is that the original code as it was promulgated in '95 had that strict hierarchy in there. There have been subsequent revisions where I think probably the last 3 items under local upgrade approval have been added, as we've gained more experience with the code. But those last 3 were not necessarily inserted in terms of relative importance.
Gotcha. They were just added because they just followed.
They were tacked. Yeah, they were tacked on. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and I think one of those probably would be like sieve analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I think another one probably is not increasing the depth of any component, to more than 3 feet below grade.
Right.
So, I would say that when you start looking at that list, you have to keep that in mind. And I think it's pretty evident where that cutoff,
Sure.
Comes. So, you've got to apply some common sense too, as well.
We all got into public health for one reason or another. Whatever your reason may be, thank you for serving public health needs.
Well, I think, we all have to do what we can to help steward the environment and do what we can to, protect what we have. Each person does that in their own way. And this, I think, was the way that I thought I could contribute.
And in 1997, I got a job using my sanitarian's license at the time to get a job in Barnstable, the town of Barnstable Health Department. And so that from 97 to now, I've been doing public health. And so I started as an inspector and now 20 years as an agent.
Well, the great thing about being in public health on Cape Cod in a small town is you are exposed to everything. So you go to your schooling, you grew up, you knew what you had at home. I had, sewers. And you get into small town public health and you have exposure to every aspect of public health. It is never the same thing every day or any day. I always come in with a plan and I always leave doing anything but what's on my plan, but I like it because you're really just moving and the days fly by. I've been blessed in Orleans. I mean, I've had a great board of health. I've had, great people in my office. So it makes it enjoyable.
we all moved here, I think, for the love of the environment. And I think people, and particularly in Eastham, resonate around that. So as you were asking, how do you talk to people that might want that extra bedroom or that extra whatever it is and are told they need to upgrade their septic system to achieve it? I think when you explain, we're trying to preserve and protect the environment and sometimes restore the environment. So we all have to look at it from that perspective, and there's no simple fix. So we all love what we have, our freshwater ponds, our beautiful estuaries, and so this is all part of it.